My son's message burned across my phone. I sold the house. Go die in the dump. The room spun, the air vanished, and the world I built with my husband shattered in an instant. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. My name is Ashley, and I am 77 years old. Just 1 week had passed since I laid my husband Richard to rest. The silence of the house was heavier than the oak casket that had swallowed him. I still hadn't taken off the black dress I wore to the funeral, partly because I had no strength to care about appearances, partly because removing it felt like admitting he was truly gone. The house, our home of 52 years, felt cavernous, echoing with absences. No rustle of Richard's newspaper in the morning, no clinking of his teacup at night, no cough from the hallway when he thought I wasn't listening. Only silence, thick and cruel. That morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of cold coffee I hadn't touched, my phone buzzed. For a moment, I almost imagined it was Richard. He had a habit of calling me from the living room when he misplaced his glasses, as if walking across the house was too much. But reality returned quickly. It could only be Brian, our only child, our pride, and sometimes our greatest sorrow. I picked up the phone with trembling hands, craving even a single line of comfort. Instead, what I saw nearly made me drop it to the floor. The words lit up the screen with merciless clarity. I sold the house. Go die in the dump. I read it once, twice, 3 times, thinking my tired eyes had betrayed me. But no, the words stayed, sharp as knives. My chest tightened. For a long moment, I could not breathe. The floor seemed to sway under my feet, and I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. This was the house Richard built brick by brick. We bought the land together when we were newlyweds. I had painted these walls, tended this garden, patched these curtains. It was here that I rocked Brian to sleep, here that we celebrated birthdays, graduations, holidays. Every corner whispered stories, every doorframe held fingerprints of a life lived in full. This house was not simply wood and stone. It was memory, safety, history. And now, with a single text, my son had stripped it away, selling not just property but my very existence. My throat burned as tears threatened, but I refused to let them fall, not yet. I stared at the phone as though it might suddenly laugh and reveal a cruel joke. But Brian's name sat above the message in bold letters. My son, my only son. I thought back to the small boy who used to run down the hallway in his socks, sliding across the floor to make me laugh. The child who brought me dandelions and said, "For you, Mommy, because you're the prettiest." The teenager who clung to me when his first love broke his heart. The man I had defended, supported, even when Richard warned me we were spoiling him. And now, 48 years old, with his father barely cold in the ground, he had texted me to go die in the dump. It felt like a blade through the chest, not just betrayal, but annihilation of every memory, every sacrifice, every sleepless night I had endured for him. The house wasn't just a building. It was the last tether I had to Richard, the last ground beneath my feet. Losing it felt like losing Richard all over again, this time with deliberate cruelty. My mind reeled with questions, each one cutting deeper. How could he do this to me? What twisted him into this man? Was it greed? Was it Nicole whispering in his ear, feeding him poison until he believed his own mother was disposable? Or was this who he had always been, hidden beneath the boyish smiles and hollow promises? I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to calm the pounding of my heart. The phone lay on the table like a venomous snake, its black screen now blank, but echoing the words in my head. I wanted to call him, demand an explanation, but my fingers refused to move. What explanation could possibly justify telling your 77-year-old mother to go die in a dump? The silence of the kitchen pressed against me, thicker now, almost unbearable. I looked around at the framed photographs on the wall. Richard holding baby Brian in his arms, his smile proud and unshakable. The three of us standing in front of the very house Brian had now betrayed, sunlight catching in our hair. My eyes burned. Those frames were supposed to mean something, weren't they? Proof of love, of family, of a bond that nothing could sever. But bonds, it seemed, could be sold. I rose from the table, my knees unsteady but my body moving as though pulled by invisible strings. I walked through the house slowly, touching the furniture, the door frames, the windowsills, each one like saying goodbye to a friend. I paused in the living room where Richard's favorite chair still sat. The cushion was indented from years of use, the fabric worn but comforting. I lowered myself into it, clutching the armrest. If Richard were here, he would have known what to do. He always had a way of seeing through Brian, of warning me when I was blind with motherly love. But he wasn't here. He was gone, and I was left alone, with a son who had chosen betrayal over blood. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the words branded themselves again across my mind. I sold the house. Go die in the dump. A message so casual, sent without hesitation, yet powerful enough to shatter 77 years of strength in a single moment. And as I sat there, drowning in disbelief, I felt the first spark of something new beneath the grief. A tremor deep in my chest, faint but undeniable. Shock had struck me like lightning, but beneath its searing burn, something darker was beginning to stir. Brian wasn't born cruel. I know that with the certainty only a mother can have. I carried him for 9 months, held him against my chest as his first cry shook the delivery room, kissed his soft cheeks when he still smelled of milk and baby powder. He was my whole world then, a tiny miracle with a mop of dark hair and eyes that looked at me as though I was the only thing that mattered. As a boy, he would run barefoot across the yard, dandelions clutched in his little fist. He would press them into my hand and whisper, "For you, Mom, because you're the prettiest." My heart swelled every time. Those were the moments that made all the sacrifices worth it. The nights I stayed awake sewing patches onto his clothes, the meals I skipped so he could eat more, the years I worked 2 jobs so he'd never feel the shame of going without. But somewhere between childhood innocence and the sharp edges of adulthood, something shifted. Brian hardened, like iron left too long in the fire. He grew taller, stronger, more confident, but also more distant. I saw it first in the way he looked at Richard, no longer with admiration, but with impatience, as though his father's advice was an obstacle, not wisdom. I noticed it in the way he handled money, never saving, always spending, always chasing something bigger, shinier, louder. Then Nicole came into his life, and what had been cracks widened into chasms. From the very beginning, she carried herself with the air of someone who believed she deserved more attention, more wealth, more status. She wasn't content with the simple joys that Richard and I had built our lives upon. To Nicole, a meal at the family table was not a blessing but an embarrassment, the house we loved not a home but a prison of limitations. I'll never forget the first time she walked into our home. She wore a red dress that clung too tightly and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked around the living room, her gaze landing on the old couch Richard and I had saved months to buy, on the faded wallpaper that I had chosen when Brian was still a boy. She said, "It's cozy," but her tone was not one of admiration. It was dismissal, coated in polite venom. Richard squeezed my hand under the table that night, as if to say, "I see it too." Nicole had a way of whispering into Brian's ear, her voice like silk wrapping around thorns. I would catch fragments of their conversations, usually hushed when they thought I wasn't listening. Words like investment, opportunity, future, spoken with a sharp edge that carried more hunger than hope. One night, I passed by their bedroom door and heard her clearly. Her voice was low but urgent, dripping with greed. "Brian, your mom is sitting on cash in that house. If you want a future with me, she needs to be out of the picture." I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. Out of the picture. That was how she saw me, not as a mother, not as a person, but as an obstacle standing in the way of her lifestyle. I stood there in the dark, clutching my nightgown, listening as Brian didn't protest. He didn't say, "Nicole, don't talk about my mother like that." He didn't defend me, didn't protect me. He just sat in silence, which was worse than any words. Silence was agreement. Silence was betrayal. From that moment, hatred began to stir in me, not just for Nicole, but for the way she had consumed my son. The boy who once plucked weeds from the yard and turned them into flowers for his mother was now a man who measured love in dollar signs, who let his wife carve out the space where I once stood in his heart. Hatred is not an emotion I wore easily. I had lived my life with patience, with endurance. I forgave easily, too easily perhaps. I'd always found excuses for Brian. He's young, he's stressed, he'll grow out of it. But after Richard's funeral, when my body was still heavy with grief, Brian's mask fell completely. The text message was the final unveiling, but the truth had been written on his face for years. I looked back on small moments I had ignored, the way his eyes lingered too long on the gold chain Richard wore, the way he once snapped at me, "Why don't you sell this place and move somewhere smaller?" The way Nicole always steered conversations back to what they could gain, what they could inherit. I saw it all now, clearly, cruelly. The realization was like swallowing poison. My son, the child I raised, the man I loved unconditionally, was no longer mine. He belonged to greed, to ambition, to Nicole's endless hunger. The boy who once clung to me during thunderstorms now treated me as dead weight, someone to be discarded so he could climb higher. Sitting in the quiet of that empty house, I felt the hatred settle inside me, heavy and unmovable. It wasn't wild or reckless. It was cold, sharp, and deliberate. Hatred, I realized, could be a strange kind of strength. And as I stared again at that hateful text, the letters burning into my mind, I no longer wept for the boy I had lost. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had chosen cruelty over compassion, greed over blood. And hatred was the only shield I had left against him. A week later, I gathered my courage and returned to the house. My house. The one Richard and I had built for nothing but love, grit, and years of sacrifice. As I walked up the path, I felt my pulse quicken. Something was wrong. The driveway was crowded with a moving truck, its engine rumbling, men in uniforms, carrying out pieces of my life as if they were nothing more than inventory. I froze at the gate, watching strangers lift my furniture. Richard's chair, the oak dining table we had saved 3 years to buy, even the grandfather clock that had stood in the hallway since Brian's childhood. They carried them down the steps without reverence, without recognition, as though these weren't fragments of a family's history, but simply items to be priced and sold. Nicole stood at the center of it all, giving orders with the authority of a queen surveying her subjects. She pointed at lamps, at rugs, at boxes, directing where they should go. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and grating, every syllable steeped in triumph. She wasn't just moving furniture, she was erasing me. Erasing Richard. Erasing the life we had built. And Brian, my son, stood there with his arms folded, leaning against the porch rail, as if this were a spectacle for his amusement. He didn't move a muscle to stop them. His face was unreadable, but his stance screamed of arrogance, of entitlement. I stumbled forward, my voice breaking as I called out, "Brian, stop this. This is my home, your father's legacy." He turned his head slowly, and the smirk that spread across his face gutted me deeper than the words that followed. "Mom, you're 77. You should be in a home, not here. We need this money for our future. You'll manage somehow." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. Manage somehow. As if I were an afterthought, a burden to be cast aside like an unwanted piece of furniture. My knees wobbled, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the steps. But I held myself upright, gripping the railing to keep from falling apart. I looked at him, the boy I had cradled through fevers, whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose tears I had dried when the world seemed too big for him. And now, at 48, he had turned his back on me with a smirk, dismissing me as though I were disposable. Inside, I could hear drawers opening, cabinets slamming, strangers rifling through decades of memories. The sound was unbearable, each slam like a nail driven into the coffin of my dignity. My chest tightened, and my breath came ragged, but not from grief this time. No, what rose in me was hotter, sharper. Anger. It wasn't the wild anger of youth. This was different, older, steadier, forged in betrayal and humiliation. It burned low, like coals waiting to ignite, and with every laugh Nicole let out, with every box carried past me, it grew stronger. Nicole caught my eye then. She smiled, not with kindness, but with satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who believed she had won. That smile struck something in me, something primal. If she thought I was weak, if she thought I was finished, she was wrong. I clenched my fists at my sides, nails digging into my palms, grounding me. The sting of pain reminded me that I was still alive, still standing, still capable of more than they imagined. The humiliation of being told I belonged in a home sliced deep, but beneath that wound, anger formed a shield. I remembered Richard's voice, steady and sure, telling me years ago, "Ashley, never let anyone walk over you, not even family. Blood may bind us, but respect must be earned." Back then, I had brushed it aside, believing Brian would always love me, that no such warning would ever apply. But now his words echoed in my ears with new clarity. I scanned the yard, the movers, the boxes, my son's smirk, Nicole's gloating posture. And for the first time, I didn't see family. I saw adversaries. They weren't just taking my home. They were taking my dignity, my identity, the last connection to the man I had loved for more than 5 decades. And that, I realized, I could not forgive. Anger is a strange companion at 77. It doesn't flare and vanish like in youth. It settles into your bones, anchors itself, becomes part of the air you breathe. As I stood there, shamed in front of strangers, anger steadied me. It whispered that I was not powerless, that I still had weapons left, even if they weren't the kind Brian or Nicole could see. Something inside me broke that day, but not in the way they hoped. Out of the ashes of humiliation, anger bloomed. It didn't drown me. It sharpened me. Every word Brian had spoken, every look Nicole had given, every piece of furniture hauled away, etched itself into my memory like fuel waiting for the right spark. I turned away from them not because I accepted defeat, but because I refused to let them see my tears. They wanted to strip me of dignity, but I would not give them that satisfaction. I walked down those steps slowly, each one heavy but deliberate, and behind my grief, a vow formed quietly, fiercely. They had cast me out, but they had also awakened something they could never control. And anger, my anger, was about to become the sharpest weapon I had ever held. I stayed silent. Silence, I realized, was a far greater weapon than shouting. Brian and Nicole wanted a reaction, wanted to see me crumble under their cruelty, but I would not give them the satisfaction. If Brian wanted to play cruel, I would play smart. And in my 77 years, I had learned that patience and calculation often cut deeper than fury. What they didn't know was that Richard had prepared for me, in ways even Brian never suspected. My husband was a cautious man, the kind who read every contract twice, who kept ledgers no one else bothered with, who knew the dangers of trusting even those you loved most. Ashley, he used to say, his voice steady as he tucked away papers in the old walnut desk, we must never let anyone corner us. Not banks, not strangers, not even family. At the time, I thought his caution was excessive. Now, I realized he had been protecting me from the very betrayal we now faced. Richard had left me more than just his pension. There was also a hidden savings account, modest in appearance, but substantial enough to give me independence. Brian had no clue it existed. He had assumed everything passed through him, as if the world owed him transparency. But Richard trusted only me with that secret. That money wasn't just numbers in a bank ledger. It was a shield. And then there was the estate. Brian, in his arrogance, believed that selling the house had been the end of the story. He thought that once the ink dried on some hurried documents, the property no longer bore my name. What he had forgotten, what he had overlooked in his greedy haste, was that my name was still tied legally to the family estate. Richard had insured it. Without my consent, without my signature, the sale could never be valid. Brian had not sold a home. He had attempted fraud. The knowledge burned inside me, not with rage now, but with clarity. I had leverage. I had the means to turn his cruelty back onto him, to make his greed the very pit he would fall into. But I could not do it alone. I needed someone who could wield the law with precision, someone who knew not just contracts, but the man Richard had been and the values he had held. There was only one person I trusted, Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter had been Richard's friend since their college days, a man with a sharp wit and an even sharper mind for legal matters. He had been at our wedding, at Brian's christening, at countless Christmas dinners where he always brought a bottle of whiskey for Richard and a box of chocolates for me. More importantly, he had been Richard's confidant, the one who knew the intricacies of our finances better than anyone else. When I walked into his office, carrying the crumpled copy of Brian's so-called deal, I felt a strange mix of shame and resolve. Shame that my son had driven me to this point, resolve that I would not let him destroy what Richard and I had built. Mr. Carter greeted me with the warmth of an old friend, but when he saw the papers, his expression shifted to something darker, half disbelief, half amusement. He leaned back in his chair, glasses perched low on his nose, and smirked. Your son overlooked a crucial clause. Without your signature, Ashley, the sale isn't worth the paper it's written on. The buyers have every right to sue him for fraud. The word hung in the air, fraud. My son, who thought himself so clever, so untouchable, had in fact ensnared himself in a trap of his own making. Mr. Carter's eyes softened as he leaned forward. Ashley, I know this must hurt you more than you'll ever say. But you need to understand something. You're not powerless. You're holding the winning card. He doesn't control this deal. You do. That's not just a safety net. That's leverage. Leverage for your revenge. For the first time in weeks, I felt the air fill my lungs fully. The heaviness that had sat on my chest since Richard's death, since Brian's cruel text, lifted slightly. I wasn't just a helpless widow cast aside. I wasn't a burden waiting to be discarded. I had power, real, tangible power, and I had an ally who would stand beside me. The anger that had burned inside me now sharpened into purpose. I thought of Brian's smirk, Nicole's triumphant glance, the sound of strangers carrying my life into boxes. Every memory fanned the fire, but it was no longer wild and chaotic. It was disciplined, focused. Brian believed he had stripped me of everything. But he had forgotten that Richard and I had lived too long, worked too hard, to ever leave ourselves defenseless. What Brian saw as weakness, my age, my silence, was about to become my greatest strength. I sat across from Mr. Carter, the weight of betrayal still pressing on me, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt galvanizing. My son's greed had written the script for his downfall, and I would be the one to turn the page. I left his office that day not broken, not defeated, but armed. They thought they had cast me aside. They thought I was finished. But I had a plan now, a plan rooted in patience, law, and the very greed that had consumed Brian and Nicole. And anger, my constant companion, had finally found its purpose. The night I invited Brian and Nicole to dinner, I chose the finest restaurant in the city, not out of vanity, but out of strategy. The place gleamed with chandeliers that scattered golden light across polished marble floors. Waiters glided between tables with the grace of dancers, and every sound was softened by the hush of wealth. This was not an environment for shouting or tantrums. This was a stage, and I intended for Brian and Nicole to play their roles while I delivered mine. They arrived late, as if to emphasize their imagined importance. Nicole walked in first, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor, draped in a dress too bright for the occasion, her hair sculpted into an elaborate crown of curls. She raised her hand dramatically, showing off a diamond bracelet that caught the light and sparkled across the room. It was a deliberate gesture, one meant to wound me, as though to say, "Look, we already live the life you never could." Brian followed, tall and broad-shouldered, his suit perfectly tailored but his expression smug. His stride carried the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable, as if his cruelty had finally rewarded him with success. He leaned down to kiss my cheek as though we were a happy family, but his lips barely grazed my skin, cold and insincere. They sat across from me, ordering wine without asking, filling the air with the perfume of self-satisfaction. Nicole laughed too loudly at Brian's shallow jokes, her manicured fingers tapping against the diamond bracelet again and again, making sure it caught my eye. To them, this dinner was a celebration, a victory lap. They thought they had already won, and that thought alone brought me a quiet, simmering satisfaction. I remained silent as the waiter brought us menus, watching them bask in their illusion. Nicole spoke of the new neighborhood they would move into, of private schools their non-existent children would attend, of cars Brian would soon test drive. Every word was coated in greed, every sentence dripping with disdain for the life I had lived. Brian leaned back in his chair, his smile cutting. "Mom, you'll see. This is for the best. We're securing our future. You should be proud." Proud. The word twisted in my stomach. Proud that they had gutted my home, stripped away the only legacy Richard and I had built. Proud that my son had texted me to go die in the dump. Their delusion was almost laughable. I waited until the waiter poured the wine and discreetly stepped away. Then, with deliberate calm, I placed a leather folder on the table. The sound of it landing was soft, but in that moment, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Brian's eyes flickered toward it with curiosity, Nicole's with irritation, as though my presence, let alone my actions, was an interruption to her fantasy. I slid the folder forward. My voice was steady, each word carefully measured. "Here are the documents. The sale is invalid. You've committed fraud. Unless you accept my terms, the buyers will sue, and you'll be left with nothing." Nicole's face drained of color. For the first time that evening, her laugh faltered. She reached for her wine-glass, but her hand trembled, the bracelet clinking against the crystal stem. Brian, however, didn't react immediately. He tried to maintain the mask of arrogance, his jaw tight, lips pursed. He glanced at the papers, skimmed a few lines, then looked back at me. His smirk wavered. For the first time in years, I saw something foreign in his eyes. Not confidence, not defiance, but fear. The silence stretched across the table, heavy and suffocating. Nicole broke it first, her voice brittle. This isn't possible. We signed everything. Everything is done. I met her gaze, unflinching. Without my signature, nothing is done. The buyers know it. And so will the court. Her lips trembled, the arrogance collapsing, leaving behind something hollow. She looked to Brian for reassurance, but he had none to give. He stared at me with wide eyes, as though seeing me not as a fragile old woman, but as the mother who still held the power he thought he had stolen. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. My heart was steady, my breathing calm. For weeks I had been the victim of their cruelty, their betrayal, their arrogance. But tonight the balance had shifted. The chandeliers sparkled above us, their golden light falling across the three of us like a spotlight on a stage. And in that frozen moment, I understood the power of silence, of patience, of planning. Their illusion of victory had shattered, not with shouting or begging, but with a folder of papers and the truth they had been too arrogant to consider. For the first time, Brian and Nicole sat before me not as victors, but as children caught in their own deception. And for the first time, I felt the burn of anger cool into something sharper, control. For once, I didn't hold back. My voice, which for weeks had been swallowed by grief and humiliation, broke free with a force that startled even me. You texted me to die in the dump. The words echoed off the marble walls of the restaurant, sharp and undeniable. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and forks clinked softly back onto plates. You sold the very walls your father built with his bare hands. And for what? So Nicole could parade around in diamonds while you drown in debt? The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room fixed on our table. Waiters froze mid-step, couples mid-bite, as if the entire restaurant had been swallowed by my fury. Brian leaned toward me, his voice low and hissing. Mom, stop. This isn't the place. He reached out as though he could press my anger back into silence the way he had dismissed me before. But I stood tall. My shoulders straightened, my spine locked in place. My voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of every year, every sacrifice, every insult that had led to this moment. You may have turned your back on me, Brian, but you will never take what Richard and I built. Never. Gasps rippled through the dining room. A woman at a nearby table covered her mouth. A man in the corner shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowed at Brian. Even strangers could see the truth for what it was, betrayal so vile it stripped away the illusion of civility. Brian's smirk faltered, replaced with a nervous glance at Nicole. But Nicole wasn't smiling now. Her face had gone pale, her diamond bracelet suddenly looking more like a shackle than a prize. I leaned across the table, the folder of documents still between us like a loaded weapon. My words poured out, unstoppable, each one heavier than the last. I raised you, Brian. I worked double shifts to keep food on your plate, wore the same coat for 15 winters so you could have new shoes. I stood by you when your father said we spoiled you too much. And how do you repay me? By selling my home from under me and telling me to die in the dump? My voice cracked, but I didn't waver. The rage wasn't just for me. It was for Richard, too. For the man who had spent his life providing for us, whose calloused hands had shaped every beam of that house. Your father built that home with sweat dripping from his brow. He poured his life into it, into you. And the moment he's gone, you tear it apart as though it meant nothing. You dishonor him with every breath you take, Brian. He flinched just slightly, but enough for me to see the boy he once was flicker in his eyes before vanishing again behind guilt and pride. The restaurant remained deathly quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every syllable. I could feel the stares of strangers burning into him, into Nickel. My humiliation had become his now, shared publicly, undeniable. I turned my gaze to Nickel, my voice cutting like a blade. And you wanted diamonds, cars, a future built on theft. You whispered poison into my son's ear until he no longer recognized his own mother. You turned him into a man who values money over blood, greed over love. But let me tell you this, your jewelry won't hide the rot underneath. Everyone can see it now. Nicole shifted in her chair, her lips tight, eyes darting as if searching for an exit. I raised my chin higher, my voice growing stronger. I may be 77, but I am not weak. You thought you could shame me, discard me, erase me. But look at me now. I am still here, and I am stronger than both of you will ever be. The room felt electric. A waiter near the bar put down his tray, his eyes wide. A couple whispered to each other, their expressions a mixture of pity for me and disgust for Brian. The weight of judgment in that room pressed against my son, stripping away the illusion of control he had worn like armor. Brian opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. I let the rage pour out one last time, my voice thundering across the marble floors. You will not break me. You will not take what is mine. And you will not erase the life Richard and I built with our hands, our hearts, and our love. Not now, not ever. The final word hung in the air like a gavel striking. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, not humiliation, power. I stood, gripping the edge of the table, and let the weight of my fury fill the room until even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate. Brian's eyes fell to the table, unable to meet mine. Nicole's bracelet no longer glittered. And I knew in that moment that the tide had turned. Once Mr. Carter moved into action, the unraveling began quickly, almost ruthlessly. It was astonishing how fast the illusion of wealth can crumble when its foundation is nothing but arrogance and fraud. The same papers Brian had so carelessly overlooked became the very ropes that tightened around his neck. Contracts were challenged, accounts frozen, creditors notified. Within weeks, the glittering life Brian and Nicole flaunted began to collapse like ash caught in a sudden wind. The house was the first to return to me. Not through pleading, not through mercy, but through law. The buyers, furious at the deception, pulled out immediately once they learned the sale had never been valid. They demanded restitution, and since Brian had pocketed their deposits prematurely, the threat of legal action hovered over him like a storm cloud. I signed the papers with steady hands, reclaiming the home that Richard had built, and for the first time in months, I walked through its doors without fear of being cast out. The furniture had been stripped, the garden trampled, but the walls still stood. My home was mine again, and no amount of greed could erase that truth. Meanwhile, Brian and Nicole's world shrank. Their creditors circled like vultures, demanding payments they could no longer provide. The accounts they thought would sustain their lavish spending were sealed under Mr. Carter's orders, frozen like rivers in winter. Nicole's jewels, once flashed at me across a restaurant table in smug triumph, were pawned off one by one. The diamond bracelet went first, then the earrings, then the necklace she had boasted about to friends. Each piece was a sacrifice to cover debts she and Brian had accumulated, but it was never enough. Their hunger for luxury had been greater than their means, and now their debts devoured them. I heard whispers from neighbors, how Brian's car was repossessed in broad daylight, how Nicole stormed into shops with credit cards that no longer worked, her face flushed with humiliation. Their friends, who had once toasted to their success, began to vanish. Invitations dried up. Phones went unanswered. No one wants to linger near the stench of failure, especially when that failure is loud and public. Through it all, I remained silent. I did not gloat, though I could have. I did not send messages of triumph, though the temptation pressed against my tongue. My satisfaction came not from words, but from the quiet knowledge that justice had been restored. They had tried to bury me, but in the end, they buried themselves. Then one evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, the phone rang. I recognized the number before I picked up. My hand hovered for a moment, the weight of decades of motherhood pressing on me, before I pressed the receiver to my ear. It was Brian. His voice no longer carried the arrogance of a man who believed himself invincible. It cracked, thin and uneven, the voice of a boy lost in the ruins of his own choices. "Mom," he whispered, and for a brief second I almost heard the child he used to be. Then came the plea. "Please, we have nothing left. Help us." I let the silence hang. The sound of his breathing filled the line, desperate, uneven. My mind flickered back to the message he had sent me after Richard's funeral. "Isolde the house. Go die in the dump." The cruelty of it, the dismissal, the way it had stripped me bare. I thought of Nicole's laughter as strangers carried out my furniture, of Brian's smirk as he told me I belonged in a home. And now here he was, begging me. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, stripped of emotion. "Now you know what it feels like to be left with nothing." There was a pause, long, hollow, filled with the weight of consequences he could no longer escape. And then, without another word, I ended the call. The phone fell silent, but my heart did not. It beat with a rhythm I hadn't felt in months, not grief, not humiliation, but satisfaction. A deep, steady satisfaction that justice, in its own cruel way, had found its mark. I did not rejoice in their ruin, but neither did I mourn it. They had chosen their path, paved with greed and betrayal, and it had led them here. Their fall was not my doing. It was their own. I had simply refused to let them drag me into the pit with them. As I sat in the quiet of my reclaimed home, the weight of the past months settled over me. The pain of betrayal was still there, yes, but alongside it now was something stronger, dignity. I had been humiliated, cast aside, told to disappear. But I had risen, reclaimed what was mine, and watched as those who tried to destroy me unraveled under the weight of their own greed. For the first time since Richard's death, I allowed myself a small smile. Not a smile of glee, but of peace. Satisfaction wasn't loud, wasn't flamboyant. It was quiet, steady, and deeply earned. Brian and Nicole had fallen, and I was still standing. When I walked back through the front gate of the house, the air smelled different. Not heavy, not suffocating as it had in those weeks of betrayal, but open, crisp, alive. The grass had grown wild while I was gone, the garden neglected, roses long withered into thorny stems. Yet even in their decay, I saw possibility. I knelt carefully on the soil Richard had once tended, my knees stiff but steady, and pressed new roses into the earth. The dirt crumbled between my fingers, soft and cool, and for a moment I felt him beside me again. Richard, leaning on his shovel, whistling as he worked. The neighbors noticed me almost immediately. For weeks they had watched the chaos, moving trucks, raised voices, Nicole's sharp laughter, and I had seen their pity in the way they averted their eyes. But now, as I stood in the garden with fresh roses waiting in their pots, they looked at me differently. Mrs. Clark from across the street paused on her morning walk, giving me a small smile. Mr. Johnson raised a hand from his porch. His usual stoic face softened. These were not looks of pity any more. They were nods of respect. They saw not a widow abandoned, but a woman who had endured, fought back, and won. Inside, the house bore scars. The rooms echoed, emptied of furniture and familiar comforts. But instead of despair, I felt determination. I dusted the windowsills, polished the wooden banisters, and laid a fresh cloth across the kitchen table. Each small act stitched the house back together, sewing dignity into its seams. Richard's chair was gone, but I placed a cushion where it had once been, as though honoring his presence. The grandfather clock no longer ticked in the hallway, but I found myself listening for its rhythm, and in that imagined sound I felt the continuity of our life. At 77, I was no longer the fragile widow discarded by her own son. That version of me had been broken in the kitchen when I first read his cruel text, when grief and betrayal pressed me into silence. But the woman standing here now was someone else entirely. She had survived humiliation, endured the stripping away of everything familiar, and still stood tall. I was no longer simply Richard's widow or Brian's mother. I was Ashley, a woman who had turned betrayal into justice, who had wrestled dignity back from those who tried to erase it. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky fold itself into streaks of pink and gold. Sunset had always been Richard's favorite time of day. He used to say, "Ashley, the world saves its finest colors for the end." Now I understood what he meant. The end is not weakness. It is brilliance, depth, the moment everything gathers into one final, breathtaking display. As I rocked gently in the old wooden chair, I thought about Brian. His voice on the phone, cracked with desperation, replayed in my mind sometimes. I felt no triumph in his suffering, no glee in his downfall. What I felt instead was clarity. He had chosen his path, and it had led him to ruin. I had chosen mine, and it had led me here, home. That was enough. The roses began to bloom within weeks, their petals unfolding as though reclaiming the garden from neglect. Each blossom felt like a victory, quiet but undeniable. I would walk among them, trimming the stems, inhaling their fragrance, and think of Richard. He had always said that roses demanded both patience and strength, cutting back the thorns, tending the roots, waiting for beauty to return. In a way, they mirrored my life. Sometimes, when the wind carried the scent of earth and blossoms across the porch, I would close my eyes and whisper to him, not in grief anymore, but in companionship. "We won, my love," I told him one evening as the sky flared orange before sinking into purple. "They tried to erase us, but we're still here, stronger than before." The words drifted into the twilight, carried by the same air that once held his laughter. And for the first time since his death, I felt peace. Not the fragile peace of denial, but the deep-rooted peace of survival. I had faced betrayal from the very son I had given my life to, and though it scarred me, it did not destroy me. Instead, it revealed the strength I had always carried inside. The house stood around me, no longer just walls and rooms, but a fortress of memory and endurance. The roses bloomed, the neighbors nodded with respect, and the sun set with all the colors Richard had promised. I leaned back in the chair, let the night settle over me, and breathed deeply. This was my beginning.